Aristotle. Who was Aristotle and how does he fit into the pantheon of all the BIP, or brains in pants philosophers? Well, Aristotle was one of the three great philosophers from the classical period of philosophers, that being Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Aristotle was Plato's star student, and Plato had been Socrates' star student. So to understand Aristotle, who is an extremely important person of the history of philosophy, we need to set him against his background to understand him fully. As you can see here, he is known as the father of science, and we're going to see why here. So Socrates, remember, um, was the first to sort of get everybody starting to look inside at the values that we have, and therefore begin to realize that reason, rationality, knowledge is the important thing about us that we need to emphasize, and that if we don't examine these deep things, that life is not worth living. Well, his student Plato, of course, picking up on that, said that, well, true knowledge is acquired independent of sensation, meaning since the world is constantly changing, what we get through our five senses is constantly changing and therefore is not reliable as the pathway to knowledge, true knowledge, which should be about things that don't change. And consequently, he is credited with being sort of the one to get rationalism off the ground. And he had his theory of forms, that physical things are imperfect copies of forms with a capital F, so that there is a realm in which these forms exist, but they don't exist physically. They exist more or less conceptually, but not dependent upon people thinking them. They exist independent of that, actually existing somehow in this realm of forms, and that everything in the world is just a copy, uh, albeit an imperfect copy, but it is something, everything in this world is striving to be its perfect version, which is its form. So this Rorschach blot here is participating in the form of butterfly, even though it is a poor copy of one. Of course, Plato goes on to write about how we should organize ourselves with this in mind, and that is what his great book, The Republic, is about. Well, Aristotle begins to, at the age of 40, mind you, after having studied all his life with Plato, begins to form his own ideas. And it's sort of summed up by this great little two-line ditty that everybody, or three-line that everybody recites. All men by nature desire to know. An example is the delight we take in our senses, for even quite apart from their usefulness, they are loved for their own sake, and none more than the sense of sight. So, what he's saying here is that information gets into our mind through the five senses. And we delight in thinking about the experiences that we have as a result of what is given to us by the five senses. The five senses being hearing, smell, taste, touch, and vision. And so for Aristotle, all knowledge begins with sensation or observation, with the experiences that we have as a result of what our five senses give us. And when we experience anything, our minds record it, and then we have something to do all this rationalizing, all this reasoning that Plato's talking about. But for Aristotle, it begins with sensation. So what Aristotle is doing here basically is he's rejecting his teacher Plato's theory of forms, that there is this realm of perfection that we are all sort of participating in and trying to reach and become, to be the best that we can be, or for all things to be the best that they can be. Instead, Plato is saying, well, I've got a problem with that because it doesn't explain change. Not that there are different things, but that things change. And so for Aristotle, you see, he says, well, what's the form for change? Because change implies an imperfection. In other words, that it isn't like something that is static and established and never changes. It is a process. So what? How do you explain that? And of course, Plato's theory really doesn't have any way of explaining it. So Aristotle says, well, look, let's stop emphasizing form with a capital F as though it's some um, pure thing in some other realm, and just understand it as like a conceptual category or a universal. So what we mean is by these two basketballs, they are very different, but they both participate in the most basic form of a spherical shape. And then a little bit more specific, they are basketballs, and they both participate in that universal of basketballs, even though they have some rather different purposes here. And so he says, look, the form of basketball brings these two actually different objects into a common category, which is even more basic, which is spherical sports object. However you want to put it. It's a ball in the most basic sense. But what specifies them as different is that one's rubber and one's yarn, right? The stuff that makes them up is actually different. I mean, even if these two balls were exactly the same size, even if they looked exactly the same, if one was made out of one type of rubber and another out of another type of rubber, right, they'd be different because of what they're made up of. Well, even if they're made up of the same stuff, you've got one pile on the left and one pile on the right. It's the matter, material substance, that actually makes them different. It separates them. So form unites and matter separates. Well, he says that, okay, so that sort of establishes how things exist, but how do they come into existence is what's fascinating for Aristotle. Aristotle, the budding scientist, right? That's one of the characteristics of Aristotle that was very different from his teacher Plato, in that Aristotle was that guy who was dissecting things and taking things apart and becoming an expert literally on a multitude of subjects. Because of what? Well, because of observation, because he was using his five senses to bring in as much information as possible and then processing it to understand his world. That's how he was satisfying his urge for the truth, his philosophical quest. And he says, happy is the man who knows the causes of things. So Aristotle changes Plato's forms into one basis of knowledge, along with three others. What are the three others? Well, what he refers to as the four causes. Um, the first being, what is it made of, as we were talking about? The material cause. What is the stuff that makes this thing up? What has it been shaped into? What is the form? That's the only thing that Aristotle was, that Plato was concerned with, was the form. But Aristotle says that's just one of four causes. What has been shaped into? What shaped it? What caused it to be this, for this stuff to be in that shape? That's the efficient cause. And then finally, and what is really, as far as he's concerned, the most important, the final cause. What is it for? What is its purpose? And this is a key into what is unique about Aristotle. He saw that everything in the world, as he looks out at it and examines it and experiences it with his five senses, he says, it looks to me as though things have a purpose, that they have a design, and that because of that design, that is where they're headed quite naturally, as opposed to knowing what something is in its most perfect form and then striving to get there. Aristotle says, no, it's not so much striving. We do that, but a human being doesn't strive to be a boat. That's not going to happen because it's not a natural thing. What does happen is you can be the best that you are meant to be. It's a quite different kind of way of looking at things. Well, so then he says there are three life forms, and this is real interesting too, because what he's doing is he's saying once matter comes into a certain shape through the four causes with a certain purpose, some matter is far more complex and interesting than others. Rocks are interesting to a point, but they're static, sort of. I mean, we don't see much change going on there. They don't do much change, but some stuff changes a lot. What is that? Stuff that has the quality that we refer to as life. And life comes in three forms: vegetative, animal, and intelligent. And vegetative is the first interesting development that matter comes into, where it seems to be able to nourish and reproduce. It takes in nourishment from around its environment and then has a way of reproducing itself. This is fascinating. This is the vegetative stage, that rocks don't do, or that basic water doesn't do. It takes a far more complex organization of stuff to be able to do that. Well, that's not the end of the fun. Then things become an even more complex um, entity when it becomes an animal state, according to Aristotle, which means now this plant begins to take in sensation. In other words, it has some kind of central nervous processing, a brain, and a brainstem and nerve endings that allow this thing to move about. It also, like vegetative state, has the ability to take in nourishment and reproduce, but it also can move about freely and take in and process information from sensation. Well, then we come to the intelligent stage of the intelligent form of life, which is human form, which has the ability to reason. So it takes in the sensations like an animal, but then it sits and can back away and think about the sensations and group them and symbolize them in interesting ways. So this is, of course, the highest form of animal and of life form. And so that's Aristotle, the father of science. And he emphasizes paying a close attention to the world we know with our senses, using our senses, and thus, in a way, he's the father of empiricism.